Daf Yud Daled Amud Beis will begin Daf Yud Daled Amud Aleph, 7 lines from the bottom with the 2 dots. Hoisiv Rabbi Kiva Mimeim Shel Kohanim Loinimnu Melachadlik. In addition to the testimony of Chanias Gan Kohanim, who said that during the entire time of the Beis Hamikdash, the Kohanim did not restrain themselves from burning basar kachim that was nitma with a vlad of tuma, with basar kachim that was knit with an avat tuma. Rabbi Kiva also mentioned Lagabe the din of shemen, that they did not restrain themselves and hold themselves back from burning together the shemen, the oil that was nifsal, became possible with their tful yom, with a nair together in a nair shenditma b'tomei meis, that became tomei through contact with a person who was a tomei meis, who became tomei through contact with the meis. And as we see from the sugya, and Rashi proves that the shemen that we're talking about over here is shemen of truma. So therefore, they burnt together the shemen of truma, even though one was nitma with a tful yom, and if it came into contact with the tful yom, that makes the shemen posel, it's nifsal, it makes it into a shlishi. The tful yom is considered a sheni, it makes the shemen into a shlishi, which means it's posel, which means it itself is considered tummy, but it cannot transmit the tumah further. And they burnt it together with the nair that became tomei through contact with a tomei meis. Let's see. Shemen shenifsal b'tful yom. What is the status of the shemen, of the truma that came in contact with the tful yom? It's a shlishi. It's a shlishi. So when it comes into contact with the lamp that became tomei through a person who was tomei from a mez. Now the person who was tomei from a mez is an avatuma. It comes into contact with the nair becomes a rishon l'tuma. So meaning you have together a rishon l'tuma together with the shemen, which is a shlishi. So you have a rishon with a shlishi. So my have it sheni. So when the shlishi comes into contact with the rishon, it becomes a sheni. And Rabbi Kiva is saying, and therefore, notwithstanding that, rather they burned it together, even though it was a shlishi. Now it becomes, and it comes into contact with it becomes a sheni. It elevated its level of tuma. Nevertheless, they burned it together. Since it's going to be burnt anyway, they burnt it together. So, for the Gemara, what's the chiddush over? What's it teaching us? Shlishi mutalases sheni. It's teaching us that a shlishi you can make it into a sheni. Hainuhach. That is what we learned out already from the Reish of the Mishnah from Chanias Gan Kohanim. That's the way we learned the case by the basar kachim. It's also telling you that a shlishi of basar kachim could be made into a sheni when you have to burn it. Rav Yud answers, and we're talking about over here a nair that's made out of metal. The nair over here, the lamp, was made out of metal. The Rahman Omar, the Torah says, B'chalal cherev harei kechalal. The Torah says a special din by metal coming into contact with tumah. The Torah says, in the case of coming into contact with the mez, so we learn now, we darshan the din by says b'chalal cherev oivemez, the hekesh to a chalal cherev, a sword, something that's made out of metal, to the mez. So we learn out that as opposed to the regular dinim of tumah, where in contact, the tumah is transmitted in descending order. So, for instance, if an av comes into contact with something, it becomes a rishon into something a sheni. With metal, it doesn't go down. It doesn't descend in the order of tumah. It has the same din as what it came into contact with. So, therefore, if a sword comes into contact with a mess, just like a mess is avi avais tumah, the sword is also avi avais tumah. If the sword or the metal container came into contact with an avatuma, similarly it becomes an avatuma. So we're saying over here that the nair in question is a metal nair. It came into contact with a person who touched them. It came into contact with a mace. So the person is an avatuma. So therefore the nair is also an avatuma. So the case that we're talking about is, it's not a shlishi with a rishon which becoming a sheni. We're talking about the shemen, the truma, is a shlish. It came into contact with the nair, who came into contact with the tomei meis. So the nair, it's matchias, it's also an av. So it's now making the shlishi into a rishon, not into a sheni. It's an av touching the shlishi, making it into a rishon. So b'chol acher harayu kachalal v'havlei avatuma v'kasavar shlishi mutal asoisa rishon. And therefore the chiddush is what he's adding over here. The chiddush that he's adding on over here is not only, like Rav Chanina Sganakam said, that the shlishi can be made into a sheni. Is with this edus he's saying that the shlishi of truma can even be made into a rishon. Because we're talking where it's made out of metal, the nair is metal, and avatuma, and therefore the nair is an avatuma, because havar shlishi mutalasais rishain, and that's the chiddush. What's forcing him to say that? Let us say that no, it's talking about a earthenware nair, a common earthenware nair. And therefore, the nair is not a rishon, and not an av, rather, that the nair is a rishon. And so what is he adding? What our question was, if the nair is only a rishon, that means you're only making the shlish into a sheni. So what's being added? No. Even there, something is being added by Rabbi Kiva. Dilu hasam, because in the case of Chanis Gana Kahanim, Tomi V'Tomi, it's talking about the meat of kachim. And on kachim, if it's talking about a rishon coming into contact with a shlishi, the rishon is tomei, meaning it is tomei and can transmit the tumah further. The shlishi of basar kachim is also tomei. It's not possible, it's tomei. It is tomei and it can transmit the tumah further to a revi, because by kachim you have a revi, so they're both tomei. So Rav Chanina Sgana Kahanim said yes, they were burned together, the shlishi with the rishon. Yes, the shlishi can be made a sheni. Perhaps I will say, well, that's over there because nothing is really being added, because even though you're adding on the level of tumah, but they're both tomei. Even before contact, the basar of kachim shlishi was still tomei. But vilu hacha pasal v'tomei. But over here, something is over here being added more than the previous case, because over here the shemen of truma, it was a shlishi, it's only possible by truma, there's no revi, so it itself was tomei, but it could not transmit the truma further. Now if you put it into contact with a rishon, it becomes a sheni. It's not only tomei, it could be matama others as well, because it can make something else into a shlishi. So perhaps that's the chiddush over here. So what's forcing us to say that we're talking about a ner of matchas, and the case is talking about that you're making a shlishi into a rishon? Maybe in itself it's a chiddush to say we're making the shlishi into a sheni, and over here, since we're talking about truma, therefore it is a chiddush because you're making something which was possible into something which is tomei. Rava says, the Kasha on the Mishnah forces us to say that. Because if we're talking about cheres, then why does it say the ner became into contact with someone who was not talking with the tomei meis, nisnation, it was sheres? Why limit it to tomei meis? You can even be talking about came into contact with the sheres. If we're talking about some of the cheres, then why do you have to come on to meis, even with the sheres? If you're talking about the kli that came into contact with the sheretz, the kli cheres would be a rishon. And yes, you would have the shlishi of truma becoming a sheni, but you're telling me that is the chiddush, that it went from something which is possible to something which is tomei. So you can say this case even talking by a sheretz. So why does it say dafke by mes ella? Why does it say a mes ella? Where do we find a difference in something in a kli? That the difference if it came into contact with a mes, with a tomei mes or a sheretz, is a matches. It's a matches. If it wouldn't be matches, there's no difference between the two. A kli cheres that comes into contact with the sheretz is a rishon. A kli cheres that comes into contact with tomei mes is a rishon. There's no difference between the two. Where do we find the difference between the two? It's dafka by metal. By metal, which comes into contact, if it comes into contact with a sheretz, it's only a rishon. If it comes into contact with tomei mes, it's an avatum. Therefore, you see that shema me'amara. So we see over here, rather, we see that therefore we are talking about this is talking about bamet, specifically matches, where coming into contact with the tomes will make it into a av, and therefore the chiddush is from here. We see from here that you can even make the truma, the shem and truma, which is a shlishi. You can make it not only a sheni, you can even make it into a rishon by having to come into contact with the ner, which is an av. Omar Rav says, Shmami, no, we can learn out from here, because of Rabbi Kiva, tumas mashkem letameachem deraisa. We can learn out from here that mashkem, liquids, beverages, which are tome, they can be metama, other things, even midaraisa. We'll see that there's a machlokes if mashkin can be metama midaraisa or not. You see from here that Rabbi Kiva holds that it could be metama deraisa. This halgadai the rabbanon, because if you hold that it can't be deraisa, only the rabbanon mechti. Well, let's see. Hi ner ma'ikal mahanyalei hai shemen. How does this ner? How does this lamp affect the shemen? So what change does it make? If to say that it itself is possible, it's already shlish, it's already possible, so it's already disqualified. And it can't be, it's already truma, which is psula. So it's already possible, so what effect would it have? Now, as we said, the case we're talking about is, according to Rabbi Kiva, that he's telling us that they burnt the shemen, which is a shlishi, which is a ner, which is avatuma, made into a rishon. Now it makes a big difference, because now you're saying that what was possible is now becoming tome, and it's not only is it itself possible, but it can be matama others. Well, that's fine if you hold that liquids can be matama others midaraisa. Now you're telling me achidish that the truma, which was possible, this shemen, now you can make it tome, where not only it is possible, it can be matama others. But if you hold that midaraisa you can't be matama others, how have you affected? It was possible and remains possible. What's this mind? No, what's your proof? Maybe Enechanami holds midaraisa it can't be matama others, but midarabanan it can. And the chiddush is that we allow you to make this truma from a shlishi into a rishon, which is tameh, which I'll call panim, midarabanan can be matama others. Not only is it possible, it was possible, remains possible, but it can transmit tuma at least midarabanan, and that's the chiddush. Gemara says no. Rabbanon, if we're only talking about a tuma rabbanon, that the liquids can transmit tuma, it's only midrabbanon. Well, if that's the case, why did the Mishnah have to say that the shemen came into contact with an avatuma? Even if it came into contact with rishon or sheni, it would become a rishon. Midrabbanon, it would become a rishon. And therefore, it could transmit tuma to others midrabbanan. Now, normally, if something comes into contact, and midaraisa, if something comes into contact with a rishon or sheni, it doesn't become a rishon. It goes down in order of the tuma. The tuma goes down in descending order. But the rabbanan were geyser by mashkim, by liquids. They were geyser that if it came into contact with a rishon or a sheni, it doesn't become a sheni or a shlishi, it becomes a rishon. That the geyser that it should jump and become a rishon. Why is that? So as Rashi explains, because liquids are very susceptible to tuma. Oichlim foods do not become tameh even if they came into contact with the source of tuma, unless first they had a hechsher. First they were huchshel kabel tuma. They had to first come into contact with a liquid. After, for instance, a fruit is picked, it had to have come into contact with a liquid, and only after that it came into contact with the tumah, it would become tameh. By liquids, there's no such necessity. The liquids themselves are considered huchshel kabel tuma. Therefore, since they're so susceptible to tuma, therefore the rabbanon were geyser that were machmer with it. So therefore, by liquids, even if it comes in contact with a rishon or sheni, to become a rishon. This on because we learned in Mishnah Kol HaPaisal Esa Truma, anything that makes Truma possible. So therefore, you have anything, even meaning even a sheni. A sheni comes into contact with Truma, it makes it a shlishi, which is possible. So even a sheni, metama mashkim liyais chila, if it comes into contact with liquids, it's metama, it makes it into rishon chutz mitful yom, except the case of its full yom. In the case of its full yom, we don't say that. Now, even though Tul Yoim is considered a Sheni, it makes Truma into a Shlishi, but since Tul Yoim is Midoraisa, it makes Pasals a Truma. Therefore, the Rabbanan didn't feel the need to be Geyser over here because people were more careful with it. But Al Koponim, what do we see? We see over here that by Mashkin, and as far as the Tuma D'Rabbanan, it doesn't have to come into contact with an Avad Tuma to make it Tomei to be able to transmit the Tuma. It could become a contact even with a Rishon or Sheni. And it would also become a Rishon to enable it to be Matama others. Elamai, since we don't say this case, doesn't that show us that we're talking about being Tomei on a Deraisa level? That we're talking about being Tomei, that it's Tomei Midaraisa, and therefore must be the Rabbi Kiva holds that the Mashkim could be Matama, others Midaraisa. So therefore, that's why we say the case over here that it's Nitma, that the Ner is with an Avatuma, and it's teaching you that the Truma, the Shemin of Truma, comes into contact, becomes a Rishon, where therefore, even though it midaraisa, it can transmit the tuma to others. Nevertheless, they didn't restrain themselves from burning it together, even though it elevates the level of this shemen, which was only possible, and now it's tome, and it can be metame even midaraisa. Nevertheless, they burned it together. So we see over here that Rabbi Kiva must hold that mashkim, which are tome midaraisa, they can be metame others, not only midarabbanan. Now we can learn out from our Rabbi side that similarly, just like we see over here, you can burn the kachim which are tame together. The kachim which are tame together, you can burn it. You can burn together the truma that's tame. You can burn it. Similarly, we learn out that on Erev Pesach you have to burn the chametz anyway. That you can burn the truma tahira with the tameya on Pesach, because even though now you're being matama the truma, but it has to be burnt anyway, so you can burn it together. So, from the words of who? From whose words can you learn this out, that you can burn it together? If you'll say we learn out from Ruchinas Chana Kahanim, I can say no, it's not a comparison. It's not comparable. In Rav Chana Kahanim's case, the Basar Kachim was Tomei. The way we learned it, there was a Rishon with a Shlish. The Rishon is Tomei, the Basar Kachim which is Rishon, and the Shlish is a Tomei. So yes, you're putting it and elevating it, and you're making it from a Shlishi to a Sheni, but regardless, it's Tomei. But here you want to learn out, you want to prove that you can even have the Truma, which is Tahira, and burn it with a Tomei. Where do you see that from Ruchinas Chana Kahanim? Rabbi Kiva, perhaps you'll say we learn out from Rabbi Kiva. And over there, Rabbi Kiva said we were talking about the shemen, which was pasul with together, and with a ner, which is tom with tom mace, and the pasul to now you're making a tome. Still, midame hasam pasul with tome achatar v'tar. Even though the shemen was not tome, but it was pasul. How can you learn out that you can burn together truma, which is tahira, with the tome? So, Nemakas of Ramer, let us say Ramer holds Mas Nisan Bava Tuma Daraisa, that we're talking about that the meat, in the case of Ruchinas Chana Kahanim, was talking about that meat that became about with Avatuma Daraisa, that was Tomei through an Avatuma, which means that the meat itself is Tomei Midaraisa. Uvlada Tuma D'Rabbanan, and the meat that became contact with a Vlada Tuma, we're talking with a Vlada Tuma, which is a Vlada Tuma D'Rabbanan, meaning there is no such thing as an Avatuma D'Rabbanan. So maybe, therefore, when we define the Mishnah, we're saying that Rav Ruchinas Chana Kahanim said they burnt together the meat which was nitma ba'avatuma. By definition, that means that it was an avatuma deraisa, because there's no avatuma derabbanan. So therefore, it means, perhaps you'll say what it means is that the meat, the basar kachim, was tome with an avatuma, meaning it's tome deraisa. And they burnt it together with meat that came into contact with a vlada tuma. What type of vlada tuma are we talking about? A vlada tuma d'Rabbanan, meaning that they burnt together a truma deraisa with a truma d'Rabbanan. And therefore, on the deraisa level, what are they doing? They're burning together Etzmei with the Tahira. So therefore you can learn out, similarly, that on Erev Pesach you can burn Truma Tameya with Truma which was Tahira. Because on a Deraisa level, it's the same as by the Basar Kachim. Umay Midivrayim, and what does it mean when he said from their words, or Rameir says Midivrayim, Midivrei Rabbi Chanina ben Sgan HaKahanim. It means from the words of Chanina Sgan HaKahanim. Because we see from Rabbi Chanina Sgan HaKahanim that he said that even on the Deraisa level, you're talking about something which is Tomei with something which is Tohar. But nevertheless, since on a Derabanan level it's Tomei, we burn it together. Here also on Erev Pesach, even though on a Deraisa level, we're talking about something which is Tomei, which is Tohar, but since on the 6th hour it's also Midrabanan, so once it's also Midrabanan, we burn it even though on a Deraisa level it's Tomei and Tohar.